The conversation around artificial sweeteners is complicated when we look at added sugars, artificial sweeteners, plant-based natural sweeteners. There's a lot behind each of these, especially around the drawbacks of each of these. And ultimately, as we talk about the science behind this, it's all about arming ourselves with the information. It's not about saying these things are bad. It's not saying that certain things are inherently make a product good either. It's about informing ourselves, arming ourselves with the information so that when we are making the choice, we're making the best choice possible that we can do for our bodies. We also want to be extremely clear that regardless of that choice, there's no judgment.
Yay Networks.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us.
I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about.
In this week's episode of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, we are talking about sweeteners, and that might seem like a really kind of a mundane topic. It seems like something kind of just like an easy peasy topic. We're breaking it down though, and we're looking at what's beneath that. Well, it's something that it's fun. It's what goes into our desserts. What goes into our drinks, our yogurt, whatever it is. There's a lot underneath that though that is not so good. And we're going to be looking at, I sound like it's the darker side. And it is. It's the darker side of added sugars. We've talked about that before on this podcast, but I really want to get into why it can be so beneficial to really limit our added sugars. We'll talk about the influence of added sugars as it relates to some of the normal things that we would think about, sugar cravings, energy highs and lows, blood sugar issues, obesity, also cancer and sugar and its real role that it could potentially play in the development of really serious conditions, including cancer. Artificial sweeteners, the pink, the blue, the yellow, are often turned to as a solution. Okay, I really want to reduce my added sugar. Let me have this diet soft drink or artificially sweetened yogurt, fill in the blank instead. Those come with other drawbacks that we'll be talking about. What's the science say behind these? And then plant-based sweeteners, we'll be looking at these as well. So some of the things we're going to be breaking down in here, we'll be giving y'all a rundown. And we've covered some of these topics in other podcasts. So I'm going to be linking to these and also kind of giving you a summary of these, kind of nutshelling some of it to kind of pull it all together in this hub of this episode. But we'll be looking at that snapshot of sugar and its relationship to cancer, the keto diet, and the potential benefit for that in certain types of cancer. We'll be looking at sugar and the sugar industry cover-up that the Journal of the American Medical Association talked about. The cover-up was from decades ago. The article was in the recent years, and it's just fascinating. And it kind of gives us that inside look at just how much money is in a lot of these industries and how much of it are we hearing and how much of it are we learning as far as really what some of the drawbacks are. And then we'll be talking about some of the recent studies that have been done on artificial sweeteners and specifically the connection there with cancer. I think that there's also a lot of question, a lot of concern with that. So I've been thinking about where to start with this. Where do we start to really dive in? And I think I'm going to start with added sugar. It's the most straightforward. It's also, I think, just kind of a fascinating story. And while the idea of maybe a sugar industry cover-up might sound like a little conspiracy theory-ish, there's actually some truth in it. So in 2016, there was a report in the Journal of the American Medical Association in their peer-reviewed medical journal. And this exposed some misleading activity, I would say, by the sugar industry. And what I'm about to share with y'all, this happened in the late 60s. It was exposed and kind of came to light just in the past 5-10 years. So essentially, the sugar industry was found to be actively misleading public perception. And again, we're talking back in the 60s, but actively misleading public perception, secretly paying Harvard researchers to publish a significant review of literature. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine back in the late 60s. And this was like one of these groundbreaking studies that was going to be talking about, is sugar bad, or, does sugar have detrimental effects on our health? And so what they found is that they paid researchers on the side to alter the review. And so this tremendous review of literature that was coming out downplayed the link between sugar and heart health, and instead shifted and focused the blame on saturated fat. So this is the late 60s. So if you can think about, why was this such a big deal? Well, these journals and these giant reviews of literature, they shape what future research is going to be, but they also shape, and this happens now, these, large studies, large reviews of multiple studies, they shift public policy. They shift policy in food. They shift what are food manufacturers making. When we see that sodium has XYZ detrimental effects, companies start to feel the pressure to reduce the sodium content of their foods, and it starts to happen. And so when back in the late 60s, this giant review of literature came out and it really downplayed and said, really, there's no issue between sugar and heart health. Instead, it's on fat, and specifically saturated fat. That's the culprit. So if you think about it, think about margarine. When did that, Parquet, when did that come up? That was in the 70s. And that was in response to something, in part to this. You think about like the fat-free craze that came in, the Snackwell's cookies. So what I found just like so fascinating about this, there was a researcher named Kristen Kearns, and she was actually a dentist, and she was with the University of California, and she was researching a whole other topic, but she found these internal documents, these confidential memos from the sugar industry, literally like down in like the recesses of a library and going through old documents. Like this is, again, things weren't computerized. Like these are just boxes and cases of documents. She was looking for something different and then ended up kind of happening upon this. I think it's really fascinating. So she found these documents, she found these confidential memos. It revealed how there was an industry trade group at the time called the Sugar Research Foundation. Today, it's known as the Sugar Association. And they worked behind the scenes to influence that scientific review. And so while this might seem like, oh, well, that was back in the 60s, Molly, like, why is that relevant? Food companies, and at that time, the sugar, what we now would call the Sugar Association, are manipulating information so that we are shifting our habits so that we're still going to consume their products. So we don't always realize just how much we've been marketed to. And so realizing that there's always going to be this battle against misinformation, we want to trust these large entities. We want to think that that doesn't happen today, that there would be certain checks in place. But we also need to be mindful that there's a lot of different agendas. And so I started out by saying it's a little conspiracy theory-ish, but this isn't just me saying, oh, wow, I suspect that there's these documents there. This was information that was pulled. It was pulled by, pulled and published by the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years back. So I'll link to that in the podcast notes. I think it's just a fascinating look. And that just kind of sets the tone of, okay, when we're looking at sugar and we're looking at added sugar and we're going to be talking about the detriments, why aren't people talking more about the detriments? Well, there's a lot of money behind that sugar industry. I did a TV segment it was in January, and it was just kind of a fun one, but a spin on how are we marketed to, and pulled advertisements from, the 50s, 60s. And it was stunning. And it was actually, I pulled a bunch of them from the sugar industry as well. I'll link to that TV segment because then you can see kind of the slides of the different ones. But things like, fuel your body well, like have sugar for breakfast was essentially like the messaging. There was one that had like a baby with a bottle, and it was like, basically the treat for your baby is to mix like Sprite in with their bottle. And that was like, going to be the treat to help, fuel your baby well. So I'll link to that TV segment so you can kind of just click through and see some of those graphics because, we were like, this is entertainment, and it's funny. We look back on those and we were like, oh, that's hilarious that was actually an advertisement back in the 50s. But now we're still being marketed to. It just looks a lot different. It may be a lot more slick. It may be a lot more savvy. So we still need to realize that what has happened in years past is still happening. It just may look and feel, and it's coming to us in very different ways. Let's take a minute to talk about the Farmer's Dog, partner for this week's episode. It has us rethinking how we feed our dogs with fresh, real food. Y'all, this is a really cool brand. So I don't have a dog, unfortunately. So we tried out Farmer's Dog with Ella Sue, my sister-in-law Tracy's golden retriever. I've talked about Ella before on this podcast. We had a veterinarian joining me talking about animal nutrition. And Ella had actually lost about 20 pounds a few years ago at the recommendation of her veterinarian. She's about 20 pounds overweight. It was a struggle for her. And so what actually worked for her, the puppy, was intermittent fasting. And she's kept it off. And Ella absolutely loves the Farmer's Dog meals. I've got photos of her if you scroll on my Instagram account, Molly Kimball RD. She's so stinking cute with it. The Farmer's Dog is fresh, real, healthy food for your dog. It's with whole meats, vegetables, gently steamed in human-grade kitchens to preserve their nutritional value. Ella's blends also included fish oil, vitamins, and minerals. Just tell the Farmer's Dog about your dog, and they'll deliver a personalized, vet-developed meal plan for as little as $3 a day. The meals arrive pre-portioned and ready to serve packs, and because they're delivered on your schedule, you'll never run out. Get 50% off your first box of fresh, healthy food at thefarmersdog.com/fueled. Plus, you get free shipping. Just go to thefarmersdog.com/fueled to get 50% off. That's thefarmersdog.com/fueled. So getting back to the sugar conversation, when we're looking at added sugar, not only is it not healthful, it's not ideal to put into your baby's bottle in the form of a soft drink, or it's not what's going to like energize you to get through your afternoon of work or whatever. Sugar is actually one of the top sources of inflammation in our body. Inflammation is a common link among the three causing health issues: cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So cancer, diabetes, heart disease. All of these are things that when you're thinking like, what do I want to avoid in my life? And you look at what is the common link of these, and inflammation is it. And sugar is one of the leading causes of inflammation. It's going to really benefit us to dial back the sugar if for no other reason than to dial back the inflammation in our bodies. A diet that's high in added sugar, it's linked to obesity, insulin resistance, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, high blood pressure. So all of these things are going to be factored in, and these are all connected to a diet that's high in added sugar. We're not even talking about things like our body weight or our cravings or any of that stuff. So I think those are things that you would already have had in your head to begin with. So adding all those other things are just another reason to say, okay, we know that there's no question that dialing back our added sugar is going to help us feel better, help us live better. What's also interesting is that link between added sugar and cancer. And I'm going to link to a podcast that I did with a researcher who has studied specifically the keto diet for cancer treatment. And he's not one who personally was, a big avid keto person himself. It's Dr. Lewis Cantley. So he's a brilliant researcher, one of the leading cancer researchers at Cornell Medical College. So again, I'll link to the podcast with him, but he, in his research in cancer and what's causing cancer and what are the different factors in our body that is influencing cancer cells. One of the things, and it's, as you hear that podcast, if you listen to it, it's complex. It's science heavy. So, but to kind of sum it up, all of our cells need glucose as a source of energy. Glucose is sugar. And our normal cells convert glucose into energy, but cancer cells use a different and faster process to metabolize sugar. And so glucose tests are actually often used to see where tumors are located in the body. And this glucose is labeled so that it can be detected in our body on scans. And then that labeled glucose, so now you can see it on the scan, where is it going in your body because it's labeled. It is then injected into the body, and then it goes to where that tumor site is, because literally the cells are gobbling up that sugar. The sugar is fueling those cancer cells. So knowing this, it makes sense that limiting or basically restricting cancer cells' access to sugar may help cancer treatments be even more effective. And so this is something that Dr. Cantley really walks through with me on the podcast. This is something that is out of my area of expertise. So what I'm sharing with y'all right now, just before this statement and then right after, this is all knowledge that I learned from my conversation with him, from researching it further after that. And so there's a lot of different ways. Dialing back our sugar, it has a multi-pronged effect in how it can help to combat cancer. And I want to be very, very clear. This isn't to say, oh, do a keto diet and that's in place of treatment. That's not at all what the end message is from Dr. Cantley. It is that dialing back sugar and maybe doing a keto style. We've also talked a lot on this podcast before about plant-based keto. I personally don't do keto. If I'm working with someone who believes and feels that keto diet is very beneficial for them, I'm going to really encourage a plant-based approach for that. So in this, what Dr. Cantley's research is seeing is that a keto diet may be effective in combating cancer in conjunction with evidence-based treatment plans that would typically include something like chemotherapy, radiation therapy, possibly surgery. So I won't go further into this, but there's at least 5 different reasons, and Dr. Cantley talks about them with me in the podcast. I'll also link to a article that we have online that also kind of sums up the information in that podcast. But there's at least 5 different ways, kind of mechanisms of action that are happening in our body that are part of the reasoning, part of why and how a lower sugar and or keto style approach can be effective in helping to support that cancer treatment. So when we're looking at summing up what we're talking about added sugar, it kind of puts things in a different lens. And to put things in a very easy way, I gave a talk actually yesterday to our breast cancer support group at Oxnard Health, and the topic, and they had a lot of questions around weight loss. Many of them had experienced weight gain through treatment. And one of the first things that we kind of jumped in with was, if I'm looking at something like cake, you're at work and it's someone's birthday and there's a cake in the office kitchen at 10 o'clock in the morning, I don't look at something like that cake and say, oh, that has this much sugar, I can't have it, or it has this many calories. My first thought is not even about all those other things we just talked about, kind of the more serious sides of things. My first thought is even more immediate than that. If I have that piece of cake or brownie or whatever it might be, or cookie at 10 o'clock in the morning when I don't really have much else on my stomach, and if I was just going to have that sugar, I know that I'll be crashing later. My energy will be dropping, my blood sugar, I would be hungrier later. And so I'm choosing to eat certain foods or to not eat certain foods because I want to feel really good and as good as I can possibly feel in every minute of the time that I have. I don't want to be feeling sluggish in a couple of hours because of a choice that I made that's, you gobble it up and it's gone in minutes. And then a couple of hours later, wow, I'm not feeling so great. I don't want to make that choice. And so when I'm looking at foods, let's just say that slice of cake in an office kitchen, that's sort of my thought is not, oh, that's high in sugar, that's bad for me, or that's this many calories. But in the immediate, that immediate like reward or opposite of reward, that immediate impact on how we're feeling, that's what for me is going to really make that decision of if I'm going to choose to have it or not. And so if all those other things that we just talked about aren't quite enough, because when we talk about our, cardiovascular disease or diabetes or blood pressure, our risk of cancer, obesity, insulin resistance, all of these things, the list goes on. But some of those seem so far reaching, and it's really easy to be like, yeah, well, these couple of cookies, it's not going to land me down that path right now. It's just a small bit. But sometimes if we can think, well, how am I going to feel after I have these? Maybe that can be a little bit more of the immediate feel. And then sometimes you may think, okay, well, I had a full meal. I had plenty of protein or plant-based fats. I had all these fiber-rich vegetables in there. And if I have a little bit of a dessert, you're going to have not such a strong effect of that added sugar. So that's sort of going into it, a little bit of kind of the lens when we're talking added sugar that I find personally kind of helps in the moment of how do I want to feel right now? And then when we add to that all those things that we just talked about, all of the data, all the science, all the things that are coming out of why it can be so key to limit our added sugars. So I'm going to kind of wrap up added sugars. I'm going to switch to artificial sweeteners in just a bit. But just to kind of sum it up, added sugars, there is a lot of messaging to us from different industries that have a really strong financial interest in sugar. It might be soft drink industries, soft drink companies. It could be still the sugar industry. We know that there was the big cover up in the late 60s. We also know that we're continued to be marketed to now, and that sugar might be marketed to us as it's vegan, it's organic, it's, a different source of sugar than just cane sugar. But ultimately, if these things are all still added sugar, it can be really helpful for us in how we're feeling right now, but also all these other bigger things that we talked about to see how can we specifically dial back our intake of added sugar. I'd like to take a bit to share about Nutrafol, partner for this week's episode. The nutrients and Nutrafol supplements support healthy hair growth from within by targeting the 5 root causes of thinning: stress, hormones, environment, nutrition, and metabolism. Nutrafol is a physician-formulated nutritional supplement made with potent botanicals. No matter your stage in life, Nutrafol has a solution. Nutrafol offers targeted formulas for women and men, clinically shown to improve hair growth and thickness through all stages of life. You can grow thicker, healthier hair and support our show by going to Nutrafol.com, entering promo code FUELED to save $15 off your first month's subscription. This is their best offer anywhere. It's only available to U.S. customers for a limited time. Plus, free shipping on every order. Get $15 off at Nutrafol.com. That's spelled Nutrafol.com, promo code FUELED. So shifting to sweeteners that are not added sugar. And we've got kind of 2 categories here. One, if we're looking at what are sweeteners that we might have in our drinks and baking and our, putting into our yogurt or oatmeal, whatever it is, what are the sweeteners that we can add that are not added sugars? So we're going to look at 2 categories of those: artificial sweeteners, and then we're going to talk about plant-based, natural, no-calorie sweeteners. In that added sugar, it would be regular cane sugar. It would also be coconut sugar. It would be honey. It would be agave. All of these things, y'all, are still just added sugar. So being really cautious as you're looking at something that's marketed to you as healthy, air quote healthy, if it's sweet, what is it sweetened with? And if you're seeing some of those things, honey, agave, coconut sugar, raw coconut sugar, organic or vegan sugar, they're still all just going to be added sugar. So making the shift to the sugar alternatives, and we've got artificial and then we've got plant-based, lower no-calorie sweeteners. Let's talk artificial sweeteners first. The biggest thing that I want to talk about here, there's a lot of mixed research on artificial sweeteners, and there's a lot of reasons for the mixed research. Some is done on people, some is self-reporting. Very few on artificial sweeteners are going to be studying people isolated in a metabolic chamber. People are out living their lives. They're self-reporting the things that they're consuming, or they're done on animal studies with artificial sweeteners. There's just a lot of different ways that sweeteners are tested, and there's a lot of conflicting results. There's also a lot of conflicting results on something like diet soft drinks. How much of an influence do they have on weight loss or weight gain? So the one area that I want to kind of tease out and look at a little deeper, one of the larger studies on artificial sweeteners and influence on cancer risk is a study of over 100,000 people. It's adults. It started in 2009. It continues on now. And so each participant is followed through self-reporting questionnaires. So of course, there's always going to be limitations when something is a self-reported questionnaire. That these are really long studies, long-term studies, far-reaching data, over 100,000 adults here. And so some of the information that is collected about them includes about cancer diagnoses, and they analyze data and they adjust the data for things like their age, their gender, their physical activity, if they smoke or not. Do they have diabetes? What's their family history for cancer? Adjusting it for all of these factors that could play a role. So they're trying to kind of get like a level playing field. And what they found was that after the researchers accounted for these other factors, The group that had a higher intake of artificial sweeteners had a 13% greater risk of cancer compared to those who didn't. The artificial sweeteners that were most represented across the spectrum of people that are in the study is aspartame, that's equal, asulfame potassium. You may see it referred to as ACE-K, but asulfame potassium is what is in products like Coke Zero. And then also sucralose, sucralose splenda. So those were the three that were kind of the most commonly consumed artificial sweeteners in the people participating in the study. And two of them, aspartame and asulfame potassium, were specifically the ones that were associated with that increase in cancer risk, and specifically increased risk for breast cancer and obesity-related cancers. So again, with this study, limitation being it's self-reported, there's also the link there, but that link is based on correlation, not causation. So again, you're not studying someone in a metabolic lab where you're controlling every other factor in there. So there's the correlation there, but we do want to be very clear that it's difficult and it's really nearly impossible to tie something as complex as cancer to one single diet component like an artificial sweetener. So acknowledging that, realizing that, seeing that that's a limitation of this, also looking at, okay, well, this is 100,000 people tracked for a really long time, looking at high consumers of artificial sweetener versus low consumers or no consuming of artificial sweeteners. And that the high consumers, those people who had that higher intake of artificial sweeteners, specifically aspartame and ACE-K, asulfame potassium, had that 13% greater risk of cancer compared to those who were not high consumers. So it's one of those, like, just knowing this, tucking it away, realizing the study has limitations, but also seeing what this data is indicating. Part of what makes this also really relevant is when you look at just how many of us use sugar substitutes. So in 2020, it was estimated that over 141 million Americans, that's just in the US, 141 million people were using sugar substitutes. That's a report from 2020. A study in 2017 found that about 41% of adults and about a quarter of kids in the US use artificial sweeteners. The top ones for us were Splenda, sucralose, followed by Sweet and Low, which is saccharin. And then the third right behind Sweet and Low was Equal, or aspartame. I was a little surprised that Sweet and Low is still as high as it is. But the top brands in 2020, which that's kind of when we have the data point for these, the order of like kind of ranking these, is Splenda or sucralose, followed by Sweet and Low or saccharin, and then third was Equal or aspartame. So when we're looking at something like that study of over 100,000 people, the effects are far-reaching because we do have such a high consumption and frequent consumption of artificially sweetened products. There's another study that looked at artificial sweeteners and thyroid cancer risk specifically. And this is a relatively small study compared to the one we were just talking about, but looking at 50 people who were diagnosed with thyroid cancer and a control group of 50 people who had a thyroid nodule, but it was benign. It wasn't malignant. They did not have thyroid cancer. So 50 people with thyroid cancer, 50 people who had a thyroid nodule, but it was benign. And the results of looking at this, and they had, again, it was self-reported, so limitation there. But the result was that there was a significantly increased intake of artificial sweeteners in that group of 50 people with thyroid cancer as compared to the control groups. And so the study suggested that an average of 4 packets a day of an artificial sweetener for about 5 years was associated with that increased risk of thyroid cancer. And again, small study, limited because it's self-reported intake of artificial sweeteners, and the data were collected from just one interview or one questionnaire. Still, though, we look at, okay, it's something to be aware of. It's something to tuck away and know that the data is pointing in that direction. Let's talk for a minute about Daily Harvest, one of our partners for this week's episode. At the end of the day, it can be easy to want to skip out on preparing a nourishing dinner. And if our fridge is empty, that urge to order in and just skip cooking altogether can happen all too often. With Daily Harvest, though, it's so easy to keep our freezer stocked with options delivered right to the door and their delicious, nourishing meals ready in minutes. Daily Harvest delivers delicious harvest bowls, soups, flatbread, snacks, smoothies, lattes, and more. They're all built on organic fruits and vegetables. We love their smoothie blends. They make it so easy to keep things interesting, mix things up. Daily Harvest creates food that's both good for us and the health of the planet. They support farmers who invest in practices that increase biodiversity and improve the health of our soil and deliver food in recyclable and composting packaging. So avoid the takeout temptation and get Daily Harvest. Go to dailyharvest.com/fueled to get up to $40 off your first box. That's dailyharvest.com/fueled for up to $40 off your first box. dailyharvest.com/fueled. The last that I'll share, I thought that this was interesting about aspartame. So aspartame, again, being equal, it's what's in Diet Cokes, etc. Looking at, okay, what is the role that this might have in fueling cancer cell growth? And then, as we said, also, there's a lot of studies out there that show no effect of artificial sweeteners and its influence on cancer risk. So the data on artificial sweeteners is very murky. It's very cloudy. It's anything but clear cut. And in just a bit, we'll talk about, well, what do we do with this? What do we take away from this as far as like how we might consider moderating our own intake of sweeteners? So we talked about added sugar. We talked about artificial sweeteners, and I'll touch briefly on the natural plant-based sweeteners. I'm going to link to podcasts that we have covered these in real depth over the past. So I want to use this as kind of a high level, big picture conversation about these, but I will link to the podcast that we have done that would give you much more meat about these topics, much more depth. So when we're talking about the natural plant-based sugar alternatives, that's where it would be something like stevia or monk fruit. Also, y'all have heard me talk about Swerve before. Swerve is an erythritol-based sweetener. Allulose is another sweetener. Something like stevia and monk fruit are very high-intensity sweeteners. You just need a little bit to give you what might be the equivalent of a cup of sugar. Things like Swerve or erythritol or allulose, they are less sweet and they measure closer to that cup for cup ratio. Again, I don't want to get into that in this conversation. I would just say those, when I'm looking at what do I prefer personally, I want to go with the natural plant-based sweeteners, and specifically those natural plant-based sweeteners that are low or no calorie or added sugar. And they all have different applications. So something like stevia or monk fruit, like we said, they're really high intensity. Some people like just a little dab of stevia in their coffee. They love it. Stevia and monk fruit, if you use too much of it, it can taste really bitter. But I will say people who like saccharin or sweet and low, kind of that tab drinker, they also tend to like monk fruit or stevia because they are so high intensity sweetness. So personally, if I'm going to reach for something that's sweetened, I want to reach for something that's sweetened with something like stevia or monk fruit or allulose or erythritol, those plant-based sweeteners, meaning they're extracted from various types of plants. They provide that sweetness in varying degrees of sweetness, and how we use them varies a lot with which sweetener we're opting for. Again, I don't want to go down that path too much because it'll take a ton. We've covered it literally for hours in other podcasts. One big thing I would say though is don't let foods sweetened with these sweeteners have that health halo for us. So just because a food or drink is sweetened with monk fruit or allulose or Swerve or erythritol or stevia doesn't necessarily make that a nutritious, healthy food for us anyway. So I would really be mindful that a couple of things, what else is in that product that we're consuming? If it's an energy drink that's maybe sweetened with one of these, we still want to be mindful that it's still an energy drink, So what else is in there? Is it really giving us real nutritional benefits? So I want to caution about a health halo simply because something is sweetened with the plant-based, no-calorie sweeteners. If you are consuming things that do have a lot of added sugar, or you're consuming things that have a good bit of artificial sweeteners in them, I would love it if you're able to find products and make that shift to things that are stevia, monk fruit, allulose, erythritol, Swerve sweetened. So making that shift if it's baked goods, making that shift when it's soft drinks, with yogurts, with ice cream, any of these things. If you're consuming something that has added sugar on the regular, a lot of it, of course, if you're having that special treat at the gelato shop, and you're getting a scoop of it, who cares what you've got going? But what are we keeping in our fridge, our freezer, our pantry? What are we carrying around with us all day that is giving us those high amounts of added sugar or high amounts of artificial sweetener? And can we find an option that is a plant-based sweetener instead? Beyond that, though, I would encourage to even dial back how much of all types of sweeteners we're using, including these plant-based sweeteners. So the more that we are pumping our foods and drinks full of sweeteners, even plant-based sweeteners, we are really training our brains to crave that sugar, to want more sweet. And we're training our brains to find pleasure in the very highly sweet foods. That matters because it's all about what's habit. It's all about what tastes good to us. And so when that yogurt is now tasting like candy, or the yogurt tastes like dessert instead of yogurt, oatmeal tastes like, the candy bar instead, let's try to gradually dial back our intake of all sweeteners, trying to have less pre-sweetened foods and beverages in general. So buying maybe yogurt that is plain, I love Greek yogurt. I love the reduced fat or even full fat more than the non-fat. I think the texture and flavor is so much better, but plain unsweetened. And then you add a little bit of sweetener. And if you may at first put a bunch of it in there, you might be putting berries and a whole bunch of one of these plant-based sweeteners, and gradually start dialing it back. The same with your beverages, if that's what you're doing in your tea or your coffee. So if you're getting a sugar sweetened coffee at the coffee shop and you look at it, you're like, oh, wow, a lot of those sugar sweetened coffees at a place like Starbucks, 60, 70, depending on the size, it could be more grams of added sugar in a single drink. And that can be 3 days worth of added sugar in a single drink. So instead of going to that coffee shop and getting that pre-sweetened, loaded coffee or dessert masquerading as coffee, doing something at home, you could do an iced coffee. You could do something like a cold brew concentrate. You could use your unsweetened almond milk or coconut milk or something like that, or one of the ready-to-drink protein drinks that's low sugar. You can sweeten it, and then you're controlling how much of that plant-based sweetener you add. And you may find you add a lot at first, and then you can gradually dial that back because you're actually getting acclimated to really what maybe that iced coffee tastes like versus that caramel whipped cream dessert that's disguised as coffee. So the first thing I would say is really trying to be mindful of, instead of buying things that are pre-sweetened, buy them unsweetened when you can and add your own. And that's the first step, or one of the first steps in helping to retrain our taste buds. So upgrading the type of sweetener that you're using. So if you've been using a lot of added sugar, if you've been using a lot of artificial sweeteners, upgrading preferably to the plant-based, natural, no-calorie sweeteners. That would be, let's say, step one. Step two would be trying to acclimate your taste buds, dial back and be comfortable and enjoy these foods or drinks with less of that. And then a note on those plant-based sweeteners. I mentioned that they all vary in their levels of sweetness. So make sure that you're looking at what the recommendation is and how much to use. And so that's going to go a long way in helping to be sure that you're happy with it. And if you are interested in exploring those more, like I said, I'll link to the podcast where I have in one, a food scientist talking through all the different kind of properties of the plant-based sweeteners with me. And then in another, I have dietitians and pastry chefs and educators and just these talented bakers joining me. And it's a 2-part podcast on plant-based sweeteners and a whole educational workshop that we hosted last summer. And so we share a lot of that and the kind of the backstory and the behind the scenes peek with y'all. Y'all heard me say it in the beginning. The topic of sweeteners is complicated. There's a lot of layers to it. And this has been just a really quick snapshot, but I hope that kind of helps understand what we mean by that. It's not just as simple as let's limit our added sugar, switch to a no-calorie sweetener. There's a lot of other things to consider there. If you've listened to my podcast before, hopefully you know me enough to know that I am also not a scare tactic person. I am not I don't like that approach. I don't like instilling fear around foods. I still have things that are sugar sweetened that have added sugar in them, but I'm very mindful and selective of what those are, and that I really love it, that it's really something that's special to me, that it's worth it to me. And understanding it's not that we're not going to have these foods, it's understanding kind of the full picture behind it, and then making that choice if we do want to still have them, making that choice with that full base of knowledge behind us. And then if we do choose to have them, do it. Go in, do not feel bad about it, and enjoy it. I don't want any of y'all looking at me with or giving me that finger wag if you see me somewhere having a sugar sweetened gelato, because I absolutely love it and I'm going to have it when I'm out and I want it. I will not give y'all the side eye on that either. There's absolutely zero judgment around any of this. It's educating ourselves. It's arming ourselves with the information on this. It's going into these decisions with that information and thinking what's worth it, what's not, and what else could I maybe do instead that would give me that same end result, that would give me that same pleasure, that same satisfaction in a way that might be so much better for my body on so many levels. So I hope this has been helpful for y'all. Always, I want to hear what you think about it. What have you learned? What strategies have you incorporated beyond what we've talked about that have been helpful in this space? I'll include the links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode, links to those studies as well. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.